Hi, Michael. How are
Hi,
you?
Annabelle. I'm well. How about yourself? Good to see you.
Good to see you. Um, it's it's great to be able to connect by Zoom because it almost feels like we're in the same room.
Almost.
Almost, yeah.
Better than nothing, that's for sure.
Yes, better than nothing. So this is really a chance for us to share our concerns and any ideas that you have to put forward about how we can go forward as a people. And it's great to get your perspective because I find your perspective so unique and intriguing. And I always learn something from it. So I want to have a chance for people to hear like how you're thinking about all this because there is so much going on right now. I don't even know exactly where to begin. I mean, there's the political stuff, economic stuff. I mean, we're in a pandemic. Um, and I don't know where your head is right now because we haven't talked since I don't know for months. We haven't talked for months,
We
and
actually,
so
last time we spoke was pre-pandemic. So
definitely
it's been a while, right? Right.
it's been a while. So I don't really know how you're processing things. So I can, I would just want to let you take the lead on where you want to start, maybe with the things that you're thinking about the most, you know.
So you
Mhm.
mentioned the pandemic, and from my perspective, there are multiple different ways that I think about it. But one is kind of larger systemic changes that are necessary, that it provides us the opportunity to begin to think about and perhaps implement certain changes, as opposed to some of the memes you might see as like, I want to go back to to how it was, the normal. Well, that's not going to happen. And I would say that we have the opportunity for a new normal, which is actually healthier for us as a species, healthier for the planet as a whole, as a complex adaptive system, and actually much more interesting for us in terms of our ability to connect and develop community. So that is one way I'm thinking about the pandemic. Outside of obviously it's horrible, the death and destruction and economic losses, all of those things are horrible. I'm not saying that they are not. But with everything like that, like this that occurs, it's an opportunity to rethink a lot of the systems in which we operate in, a lot of the institutions which drive our lives, and a lot of the ways we show up in the world. So that's kind of like a big picture way of that I think about. And if you like me, I can kind of do a deep dive into some of the things more specifically that it leads
Mhm.
me to think about.
That would be great, actually. I would like to hear it.
So, for instance,
Mm.
um, I see a lot of people complaining, and understandably so, about having their kids home because they have to juggle work and their children, as one example. And I understand this is no value judgment because people are used to having other people raise their children 8 to 10 hours a day if they're in school, elementary school, middle school, high school, 8 to 10 hours a
Mhm.
day, or if they're younger kids, then they're in some kind of daycare. Okay, no value judgment. That's just the way our society has organized ourselves. I would suggest, though, that that is not the best way in terms of human health, well being, and connection to organize family life. Family life is best when the families are actually together a lot more of the time than not. And let me define families as not just a nuclear family with a mom and dad or mom and dad, whatever combination, but the nuclear family needs to be a nucleus of a broader family, which is part of a larger community. And I would say that this is an opportunity in that case for us to rethink that whole family structure as well as community structure and stop allowing, stop thinking that it's helpful for the growth of new human beings for them to fully thrive as they grow from children to adults, to have them separated out um, by age in terms of school, taught in an industrial factory setting like public and private schools do, and then expect them to be autonomous Democrats. I don't mean Democrats and Democratic Party, but autonomous individuals where they act freely on their own impulse and knowledge base, but Democrats in the sense of being able to work together You can't work together and consensually and take decisions together and work cooperatively is what I mean by the democratic side of things. You can't have that kind of person in an industrial authoritarian system like the schooling system we presently have. You can't have strong families, broadly speaking, which are really important if you look, especially look at the research, if you break the families apart and have the kids separated for 8 to 10 hours a day, mom or dad or mom or mom or mom, dad and dad, whatever combinations, spending an hour or two in traffic each way, to 8 to 10 hours at work. They come home, they're fried, understandably so. There's barely enough time for their own health and well-being, let alone taking care of their partners in a loving, caring way, taking care of their kids in a loving, caring way. So the way we've structured our industrial capitalistic society pre-COVID is not conducive to human health and well-being and long-term thriving. That's one example.
Interesting. I like that take on it. So it's basically a reset, a potential opportunity to reset our values and our institutions. But there needs to be a vision. There needs to be a shared vision for where things could go, how we could evolve. So there's an intentional evolution happening and not things just kind of happening in a weird state of vacuum and anxiety, right? We don't want the Walking Dead situation.
That's for sure too. But let me suggest if it's both and. So I'm not a strong supporter, and this is just kind of my libertarian sensibilities, of any kind of concentrated power, political, economic, or social, top-down structure. So I wouldn't want someone with a vision to force it upon everyone else, because we've seen historically what happens when someone with a vision uses the force of government on other people. You usually lose millions of people in death camps and horrible things like that. So it's not that I want to force things upon people, but I think you use a correct term, or a term that I would think is appropriate for this conversation: evolution. You want people to evolve their thinking and ways of being in the world, which would have them begin to see the benefits of connecting with each other differently, with how they spend their money differently, how they spend their time differently, how they want to engage with mediating institutions differently, how they want to recreate systems which support human health and well-being and ecological health and well-being. So it's not top down, but it's evolutionary. And with an evolutionary model, it's multiple different models and maps coming together and interacting with one another. So even if I think I have the best vision that's non-coercive, and I don't want to put people in death camps, obviously, I still would say it's limited because I'm a human being and I'm limited. So I'd want to see multiple experiments going on and see what emerges as the better or best possibilities, multiple best possibilities, not one size fits all.
Right. No, I hear you. I guess the other day I was trying to think about the ways in which we're alike and different in our perspectives. And because I mean, when I talk to you, I kind of fall under a spell and I feel like I agree with everything you're saying.
Uh-oh. Don't do it.
But I know we land in different places, not always, but often we land in different places. And I guess it maybe comes down to this. I feel like our culture, our civil society, is failing us, right? Like we don't have effective ways of thinking together. And I think that's what culture is supposed to help us with, is to help us think together. So it's not imposed top down from the government, but that we are evolving together. And when there are agreements, it's not forced, but it helps us to collectively take action. But our culture is failing us, and it's very hard for us to communicate, right? And you know this as well as anybody. It's so hard to get people with different ideologies to actually sit down and communicate and work together. And so I guess that's the question I have for you is that, I mean, do you feel confident that without government intervention, that we can actually take effective collective action to do all the things that you think would lead to long-term positive change?
So let me, and I think it'd be helpful before I answer that
Mm,
question is to redefine libertarianism the way I'm using it as in a post-conventional sense. So you brought up government, and I've mentioned government before, not using one size fits all and forcing people, using force to put a vision on all people. But I would also like to say that I have concerns about all forms of concentrated power. So
mhm,
it's not just the state, although they can kidnap, kill, and steal from you legally. They have the authority to do those things. It's called putting you in jail, and we've seen, unfortunately, police kill individuals, and they can steal your property, civil asset forfeiture, et cetera, et cetera. But there are other institutions which I also have concern about that are in the economic and social space, which we can also talk about too. But I just want to let you know that it's not just the individual and the government
right.
is my lens I see things through. Um, and I would say that yes and no to your question. I think we need to work within governing institutions and government institutions
Mhm,
because they have a lot of the resources and a lot of the power. But I would not strictly rely on them because they're overly bureaucratic and slow and built, I think, intentionally that way, which is
mhm,
both a good thing for a lot of people and a bad thing for a lot of people. So that means I think we need to create institutions outside of the government which can parallel the things we want government to do, but more quickly and adapt more quickly to the needs of the people and to information as it comes in. So, for instance, you and I have talked about this. One of the things that I have concerns about in terms of concentrated economic power, which is also concentrated political power, is big ag.
mhm,
The power that big ag has, the power that big medicine has over our lives to determine the health of us. They define health, which I think they
mm,
define it improperly. They they have way too much power over our lives, and there are
sure.
ecological consequences, especially with big ag, less so with big medicine. But even with big medicine, you can still find, unfortunately, a lot of drugs now in the water supplies, as example. So, with those two things, I think there are things that people can do in terms of how they organize and create new institutions, which does not rely specifically on the government. Because if you wait for the FDA to get it right or the
Mhm,
USDA to get it right, I think you'd be waiting an awful long time in terms of, for instance, regenerative agriculture when it comes to
right.
big ag and
Mhm,
conventional agriculture versus regenerative agriculture, or integrated precision medicine as compared to conventional medicine supported by the FDA. So we shouldn't just grovel to these government agencies to reform themselves to support the things that we think are the best way of approaching these
mhm.
institutions, food and drugs, or food, drugs, and medicine. But we should create alternative institutions through which we can experiment and try new things and new
Okay,
systems that support these institutions.
okay. I guess yeah, I'm just trying to like wrap my head around how do we create new institutions? Because, for instance, like if the way we approach trying to rein in concentration of power by big ag is through regulation, right? Government regulation. That's how we do it now. We try to do it. So, what else can help rein in, say, the power of big ag?
So I would say regulation is obviously one way, and
Mm-hmm.
usually, and unfortunately, my experience having spent 20 years working, at the federal level, national issues, most regulations support or created in order to support big business at the expense of small business and family-run businesses.
Mm-hmm.
So regulation might have a purpose, but unfortunately, usually used against the same people you and I might support, or the same
Mm-hmm.
businesses, types of businesses. But you can use market forces and you can use education as two other examples. So with regenerative agriculture, I come from the center right, the libertarian conservative right. So a big hero of ours is Joel Salatin. He calls himself a lunatic Christian farmer or something like that. Um, he he's in Virginia, and he actually does regenerative agriculture. He has a holistic approach. So any things that are considered waste are actually part or actually food for another process within his farm. So there are no wastes. So it's not destructive to the environment outside of the farm. His farmers don't have to wear biohazard suits because he's literally a post-organic farmer. Because even organic farming is a problem if it's a monocultural crop production system. You can do monocultural crop production organically, which is better, but you're still going to destroy the topsoil. If you use a regenerative ag or holistic approach, then you keep the topsoil healthy. And I'm not a farmer. He can explain how you do that, but that's how they do it. He is popular amongst a lot of the conservatives and libertarians. So the question would be, how do you get his type of farming even more popular among people who spend money in the marketplace? Because he's not alone. I mean, there are tons of farms out there who do regenerative agriculture. If I can take my money and you can take your money and start buying from them, it increases their power. They can market more. We can buy more from them. More farmers will turn to that. And you start shifting the marketplace through how you purchase. There are also regulatory changes that need to be done. For instance, there's the Prime Act, which is now in the House and Senate. Congressman Massey is a Republican from Kentucky. He lives off the grid. He's a really interesting fellow. And Congress Lady Pingree from Maine used to run Common Cause. They've joined together in the House to push the Prime Act. So there are efforts that are bipartisan in the House and Senate, which would move the system in a certain direction. I think ones that we would support. But just as, or even more important, is us making decisions every day of where we spend our money on food and how we educate our friends and family members how they should spend money on food, specific to food. And then we can have the conversation on medicine as well.
Yeah. Okay, I'm starting to understand a little bit more what you mean by other institutions. So let me ask you to step back a little bit.
Sure.
Okay. Stepping back, trying to take a big kind of holistic snapshot of what's happening right now. Okay. So let's say you're writing the history of now, 50 years from now. Like, what is happening? What is happening?
Well,
what's going on, Michael? There's so many things that seem to be falling apart. What's happening?
So the way I like to describe it is President Trump has given us the opportunity, if we take it, as in the Wizard of Oz, to look behind the what's it called?
Curtain?
The curtain, and see our culture and our various governing institutions and business interests and how they interact with one another. My concern is something you and I have talked about offline, is that if Biden happens to win this November, that everyone's going to go, we can go back to how it was. Everything's okay now because Trump is gone and his cronies are gone. And I would suggest that even though he and his cronies are exemplars of the problem to the extreme, the problems will still remain. They just won't be as gross. They'll be a lot more subtle, which means most Americans will go back to sleep and go, everything's going to be okay. I would suggest that, let me put it this way, I would hope that the opposite could be true, that we'd see that Trump is a manifestation, to the extreme, of our culture and the systems that run and the institutions that run our culture, and that gives us an opportunity to look critically at all these things and start making the changes, as opposed to, let's just go back to how it was, in the Obama years and the Bush years or previous to Trump. 50 years from now, I'm hoping that we look back and we look behind would you say the
curtain,
and see how it's all being produced. and we make the
Mhm.
changes that are necessary.
So, an example of a necessary change, in your opinion, that it's like this has to change in order for us to make progress.
Sure. So one of the issues I work on is defense. And if you look at our friends at the Project on Government Oversight, POGO, they put out a report almost every year, and we spend about $1 trillion on national security, as an example.
Okay. Hmm.
700 billion, I think this year will be spent on defense. Then you add in the intelligence agencies and Department of Energy funding that's defense related, et cetera, and it grows about $1 trillion. So we are what, $25 trillion in debt and rising, $26 trillion in debt. That and our
Mm.
whole economic system domestically and internationally is based on debt spending. That's not sustainable. Eventually that's going to stop and the whole system's going to collapse. I can't run
Mm.
on debt and survive long term. I'm not going to live off credit cards for a certain amount of time, then it's going to collapse on me. Well, the same thing with the government at all different levels. And it's not just the federal government. If you look at our friends at Truth in Accounting, there are a lot of states that have taken some of their expenses off the books
Mhm.
because they can't show the citizens of that state actually how much debt they have if they actually paid out all the money that's owed. I mean, we're in a lot of trouble that way. With that said, we need to look at where we spend our money. One of the places we spend our money is national security. I would say we spend way, way too much money, especially now that we're not fighting in Iraq and we've drawn most of our forces in Afghanistan. And that's not to get into whether we should have been there or not, but we're not in a Cold War. We're not fighting the Soviet Union or preparing to fight the Soviet Union. The global war on terror is winding down. It's not completely over. We still have special operations and intelligence assets fighting all over the globe. But we don't need to be spending $1 trillion, both because we can't afford it and it's a misallocation of resources. There's a report by Veronique de Rugy a couple years ago that I think it's every dollar that's misallocated to defense is $1.26 out of the economy.
Mm.
I mean, so we can't afford it, and it's misuse of money, anyways. And you and I can have a debate what you should do with the money. Should you pay down the debt? Should it go to social programs? That's a conversation that should be had. But we also have to tie the conversation of what are our priorities. We can't pay for things for the Chinese and the Saudis and the Japanese funding everything. Either we as American citizens have to determine what our priorities are and pay for them.
Mhm. I see.
My take. I'm not a fan of
Yeah,
debt,
no, I
obviously.
think, yeah, no, absolutely. I can definitely agree with you on the defense spending. Um, I think I was ready to hear you say we should just return the money to taxpayers, instead of finding other things to spend money on. But
Well, so I'm in part of a transpartisan coalition that does work on defense reform, and a lot of the center right people either talk about returning the money to taxpayers,
yeah.
but the taxpayers really didn't put the money in. I think if you
Hmm.
look at it, it's actually money from China, Saudi Arabia, and Japan and other countries that fund our debt. I mean, we most of the money our government spends is not
Yeah.
through tax, it's
Yeah.
through debt. So so my
Yeah.
take would be I think it's irresponsible to not pay down the debt. I mean, that'd be my take. We can have a debate on it. You
Right.
might say we should put money into social programs. We can have that conversation. That's cool. But we
Right.
shouldn't be
Hmm.
wasting it on weapons programs we don't need, like the F-35, the littoral
Hmm.
combat ship. And I think, I favor a very strong military that's really used. And I'd rather see ourselves engaging other countries diplomatically, culturally, economically, not through force. Even economically, I don't want to coerce other countries to do our bidding. I want a free exchange of goods and services, which is different than some of these trade agreements we have, which destroy other countries. I don't favor
Hmm.
that. But military should be the last resort on how we solve our
Right.
problems.
I want to ask you something else that
Sure.
I think is related. Um, and it has to do with culture of violence.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you remember Michael Moore's film Bowling for Columbine, but he connected what happened in Columbine with these teenagers
Mm,
gunning down their fellow students with the military-industrial complex.
mm.
You know, there's like big Lockheed Martin headquarters there, and so many people just accept that this is a very important part of our economy.
Mm.
You know, these contractors, and so, but then of course, it leads to people actually being victims of violence and a culture of violence where we think not only is it okay to use violence to resolve conflict, but people are applauded, right, for being tough or badasses or whatever,
Mm.
masculine. And I just like, oh, how do you see this? Because I feel so disturbed at such a deep level, like say what's happening in Portland right now to the
Mm.
protesters,
Mm.
the just the police brutality and all the gun violence. I mean, there's just so much violence in our culture. And
So
so I'm just, what is your take on this? Like, how do we
I,
even
I
approach
would
this?
break it into pieces, and everything's interconnected, but I'm just going to, for conversation's sake, break these into just pieces for our discussion purposes. My understanding of the shooter in Columbine was he was on psychiatric medication. Now, I could be
Mhm.
wrong, but I believe a lot of the shooters are actually on psychiatric medications and or they're not taking it as prescribed.
Right.
If you look at the black box warnings, I used to work for Dr. Bragan. He was a psychiatrist who was highly critical of some of these psychiatric drugs, and he's the one who helped get the black box warnings on these drugs.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Well, not just why. If you read them, some of them can increase homicidality and suicidality. So we need to be really careful of the large amounts of psychiatric drugs we're given to kids,
Yes.
generally speaking. Not
Yes.
only
Mm-hmm.
kids, but little kids. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
if you look at the research on kids in foster care, the polypharmacy, meaning numbers of drugs that any one child is on, is really disturbing because we barely research the effects of one drug on a child. If we do at all, it's usually for adults, let alone multiple different drugs. And what are the long-term consequences to cognitive function,
Mm-hmm.
self-management, clear thinking, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one area I think we should look into really
Mm-hmm.
deeply.
Yeah, I agree.
Overuse of psychiatric drugs.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
I would also suggest we need to look at diet nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
There's some, I remember Dr. Blaylock, I think it was his name, in the 90s, put out some research that showed a connection between certain foods, and behavioral outcomes, academic and misbehavior, like in terms of some of the violence that you're talking about. And if I remember correctly, there was some connections between diet and behavioral outcomes as well as academic outcomes. So I would imagine the fake food. I mean, like the way we feed children is just really disturbing. Forget the
Yeah.
drugs. I mean, drugs is horrible in themselves.
Yeah.
And I don't want any one family to listen to this. I'm not judging any one family because I don't know your situation. Drugs might be appropriate for you and your children. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying as a general cultural phenomenon, I think we should look at this more closely. We should look at our food, what we feed our children. I
Mm-hmm.
think we also need to look at their screen time, television time. These things are having major effects on the brain of children and their inability to manage internal states, the dopamine rushes that they get. I mean, I think we're setting our children up to be problematic adults and their ability to relate to one another in a deeply intimate, meaningful way, in a healthy way. So those are some of the factors I think we should also look at too, besides kind of the military-industrial complex and the culture of violence that you talked about as well. Because I think if you look at human history before agriculture, majority of the tribes did not have the kind of, they're very egalitarian, did not have the kind of violence that we see today, even though Pinker says we're getting less violent. If you look at people such as uh, Dr. Christopher Ryan, in his book Civilized to Death, he makes references to other anthropologists who point out that it's agriculture, industrialism that's actually contributing to a lot of the problems we face, including violence, because our prehistoric ancestors actually had a lot less violence, intra-tribal violence, than we see today. Maybe we need to look at the research, who's right, who's wrong. I would tend to agree that that there's something about small tribe living that's based on kind of an egalitarian mindset that would probably lessen the potential for violence. There's a great movie I just watched, and I'll get you the name of it, and it's a woman who's in Ladakh. Is it Ladakh? Outside of Tibet, between it's Bhutan, that area. And they had a very egalitarian system, and then American consumerism came in. And there was good relationships between the the Buddhists and the Muslims who lived there. And once like our Western way of life came in and people had to live towards the Joneses type of things, health declined, violence increased. I mean, there was no violence, and now there's like inter-religious violence and family structures breaking apart. So I do also think part of it is diet, nutrition, too much drugs, bad TV, or not bad TV, too much television, digital equipment, lack of family cohesion. I mean, nothing against single moms or dads, but it's so much better if you have two parents and aunts and uncles and neighbors who care and can keep track of one another and support one another. When you have this kind of very agenic culture we have, I mean, it's that I think is a contributing factor to some of the violence. And as a martial artist, I've been studying martial arts, for 40 years. I think there's something useful in teaching people how to protect themselves and use violence for very narrowly specific ends of what we call being a sheepdog, of protecting other people. So I would not imagine in our culture that we would ever completely get rid of violence, but you can use it. You can teach people to learn to manage their own states. And as Junri would say, who I studied with when I was like 12, might for right, use your power for goodness. So I think you can use some of the energy that children have towards sports, which I think is a good thing, and or towards the martial arts, which teaches them how to use violence towards positive ends for self-defense, self-management, things like that. A couple different pieces.
I mean, and again, I feel like I don't know how to start. Like, how do we actually make these enormous changes here? Because it is very multifaceted. And I agree with you about the pharmaceuticals and I mean, so it's not necessarily I disagree or anything, but I think when I feel compelled to seek government solutions or policies, it's because I want to get there as soon as possible. How do we get there? And I think that's why we start talking about laws and policies, because to start to make a dent on, say, this problem of overprescription of, medicine, or how we eat, right? Or the family unit, lack of cohesiveness. I mean, they're just such enormous problems that's going to require so many people to actually change. And I guess that's why we're like, well, okay, if we had a policy that motivated people, right? If we changed the tax laws so they motivated people, if we did that, like it's a way of just trying to incentivize people to do the right thing, in my opinion. I guess that's kind of why I tend to look for policies and government solutions.
Well, I think there's some truth there. I mean, because if you look at a lot of the things we just talked about, they are a result of government policies. So you might as well, I'd rather them be neutral to positive as opposed to destructive. Because if who decides what dietitians learn and how they provide their nutritional counseling? Well, it's based on the USDA pyramid, which is decided by big
Yeah.
ag, not by very good science. So my preference in terms of policy is, at least if you're going to, how you educate people who educate other people on food, you should at least have it based on good science. So yeah, we can change the policy. So the USDA is promoting good food choices as opposed to politically driven or economically driven food choices. So I'm okay with doing less damage, going to neutral, or at least more positive. But I think that takes, that will take a lot of time, which is fine. That's just the way the process is. And we should do that. You should work for more transparency, less corruption, better science, all that completely true. But I think you also need to parallel track with that in terms of social change, is to work with individuals, work with institutions that exist. Like, for instance, medical schools, conventional medical schools. I don't mean like the Andrew Weil Medical School in Arizona. How much nutrition do they teach? Maybe 3 hours?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I mean, and everyone eats, and food provides the basic substrate of everything we are as physiological, biological beings, and they get a couple hours maybe of nutrition.
Yeah.
I mean, so you can look at these various institutions and start changing them too, not just wait for government to make their edicts. And I would say even go local. Okay, let's work on the federal government. Cool. How about the state government? How about the local government? What can you do to help affect change there for positive outcomes that you're seeking locally?
I see. Well, so given that right now it feels like things are really falling apart. I mean, you're calling it sort of seeing things behind the curtain. Like it was always there, but now we're seeing it. But it also feels like things are unraveling. And I don't know. I'm not sure where to look to kind of create some sense of stability and strength and hope, right? I feel like I'm spending a lot of time like unconsciously looking for hope because it's so scary. I mean, on a day-to-day basis, I find like 10 things that scare the heck out of me, and I'm sure I'm online too much, but
turn off Facebook.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Get off Facebook. But I just don't know where to look exactly. Like, where do you look?
So a few different things. First, I recommend historical context is helpful. If you look at things like 1968, 1970, around that time, we actually had a lot more, probably 68, a lot more violence in the street than we do now. And I'm not saying, oh, the violence is great because we have less of it, but we shouldn't have any. But the social discohesion we were seeing was a lot more in the late 60s than it is today. And we survived that. I mean, I think there's like 1,200 bombings that Weatherman Underground did at R2C centers across the U.S. at various colleges and universities, as an example. And then you had the 68 Chicago, riots around the election in the street. So, so there have been historical precedents for what we're seeing today, which have been a lot worse. Civil War, as an example. So not to say we should dismiss what's going on today, but historically, we've gone through this before. We've survived, and we will survive again. Is one thing.
And I mean, it's not that I don't agree with that. It's just that, like, to go from point A to point B, and we want to get to a better place, right? Not slightly better, but like maybe for that reset you're talking about. Like, in order for us to have that kind of reset as a society, it does seem like there needs to be some way for us to even imagine an alternative.
Yeah.
And I don't know where to find that. Like, and I watch a lot of documentaries
Huh? So
And,
a few different
mm,
things. One thing that we all each can do is self-care. I teach meditation, and one of the things that you pointed out that I go through, that you've gone through, especially when you spend a lot of time on Facebook, Twitter, watching the news, is that the part of our brain is activated that's the fear response.
mhm,
And when we get the fear response, we have all the neurochemicals that are released, and it has a whole host of problems, including reducing our ability to think clearly,
mhm,
because it activates earlier parts of our brain as opposed to the
right.
human part of our brain.
Mhm,
So just with that, meditation can be a great tool. And you can do moving meditation like a yoga or a tai chi to calm down the amygdala and increase the capacity of your prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of your brain. That would just make you feel better, and not you personally, but all of us feel better, and allow us to take better decisions and see things more clearly. Because when we're kind of activated from the emotional part of our brain out of fear, we don't see things as clearly, and we don't have the long distance thinking that we could have
right.
when we're thinking more clear of the prefrontal cortex. So meditation, moving meditation, yoga, tai chi, or something like that, is something we all can do. And eat better. I mean, the better
Yeah.
we take care of ourselves, we give ourselves the chance to act more
Mhm,
freely, clearly, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So eat better, exercise, all those kind of good things for self-care. And then look in the environment. You can go online, look in the world for these great experiments that are going on
mhm,
that can give you hope, and connect with those people. Like, for instance, one of the movements I think is fascinating is the minimalist movement. Joshua Becker, the Minimalist, which is actually two guys. They have their own podcast. There, Miss Carver. There are people out there who are like progenitors of the minimalist movement. You can go read their books, read their blogs. But there's a growing segment of people who are recognizing that consumer culture is not the way to live our lives, keeping up with
yeah.
the Joneses. We need less to live more. Connect with those people. I'm sure there are
Mhm,
people down your street who are like thinking that way, who want community, who want more engagement with other human beings to follow their bliss, not to buy more shit we don't need. So, as an example, that could be one example.
yeah.
And there
Mm,
are tons, and I'll have to get you the name of it. There's an organization that I just joined, which is looking at localism,
mhm,
like these really interesting experiments at the very local level. That's very critical of globalism, economic and political globalism. And it's not nationalism, it's localism. So it doesn't matter, like, are you an American, or are you white, or are you whatever. It's not about that. It's about community people getting together and saying, we want healthy food, community gardens.
mhm,
You know, we want education. Okay, we're going to create democratic free schools or homeschool cooperatives. We want different ways of approaching healthcare. Great. We're going to create community clinics. I mean, really interesting experiments going on at the very local level all across the globe,
mhm.
which can also give us hope
Yeah,
too.
definitely. Yeah. Um, well, I'm wondering, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I'm just wondering if there's like a call to action, like there's something that you would like people to do that you think would lead to a better outcome, better reset.
Yeah. Well, a few things.
Hmm.
So do what you need to do to get through this November and move the political system in a different direction. But realize that that's step one. That's not it. As I said, and I think I'm correct, that he is just the exemplar of the sickness of our institutions, of our sickness, the narcissism of our culture. We
Yeah.
have to deal with that. And the next steps, besides what we do in November, is taking care of ourselves.
Hmm.
Eat right, exercise, get sleep, meditate, do movement practices, grow a community. I mean, COVID makes it a little bit more challenging to grow a community. Find other people out there who are doing really interesting things that enliven you in areas that
Mm-hmm.
are interest you, whether it's medicine or health or education or food, whatever your thing is, go find that and support that with your time, money, and energy. And also support your neighbors more immediately. You know, if we can go to our neighbors who are having difficulty because their kids are home, or maybe there's an older adult in the house, and, you know, there's a lot going on with our world, how can we help our immediate neighbors to reduce the stress so they
Mm-hmm.
can help reorganize in their lives to make stronger families, the nuclear extended family, all the things that you and I talked about at the very beginning? How do we encourage employers and even the federal
Mm-hmm.
government and the state governments to change their
Mm-hmm.
policy in terms of telework? Because it's working. You know, most people are now who are employed are working from home. Well, is there really a reason to go back into your cars for 2 hours a day and have to go to an office if you're capable of working from home with your family and your neighbors and having a life that's not 10 hours of work every day and a couple hours in the car? And so how can you support one another locally to do that? How can you change policies at the business level and the government levels, the various levels, to influence that? Those are some of the questions I would have for things, next steps to do. Also, you know, people are homeschooling. Even if you're in public school, you're homeschooling. And what's fascinating is when you talk to parents, they realize that you can knock out a day of school in a couple hours versus the 8 to 10 hours kids are in school. So what's going on with all that extra time? It's wasted time where children are actually not learning. Well, can you create co-ops, educational co-ops? There's got to be someone in your condo, in your apartment, in your neighborhood who's real knowledgeable about X that your kids would love to learn about. Great, hook them up, get them connected, bring couple kids together as appropriate with COVID, obviously, and create little groups of kids at various ages who are learning together something really interesting for them, like the whole unschooling movement. Support natural curiosity of their kids, because this industrial factory paradigm of schooling only works if you're creating cogs in an industrial wheel, you know, non-thinking people who can work in
Right.
the industrial capitalism paradigm. Well, we're past that. Hopefully we're past it. We're moving past that. We need whole people who can think critically, who can engage with one another, autonomous Democrats, as I said at the very beginning, who are inclined to learn, lifelong learning. Help set that up. What do you
Mm-hmm.
have? Not you necessarily, but you know, you're a skilled movie maker. You personally, you are a skilled movie maker. You're where you live now. Man, I bet there's some kids in your neighborhood who would love to learn how to make a movie based on your skill
Mm-hmm.
set. Wow, that's awesome. Because just think of what they learn making a movie. It's 1,000 times more important than them sitting in the 50-minute class, ignoring the teacher because it's really boring, moving on to the next class, ignoring the teacher, or overly stressed because they need to be
Right.
perfect and get straight A's to make it to that right college, as opposed to be driven by their innate interest in something and then support that innate interest. So
Mm-hmm.
those are some of the things that we can all do to improve our own lot and improve our family's lot and improve our community's lot in life.
Mm.
And go vote in November too. That's
It's
important.
it's really interesting how you break down like a political problem into personal lifestyle choices.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating. Well, I would love to spend some time going deeper into some of the ideas or inspirational people that you just mentioned.
Great.
So yeah, I would love to connect with you so that maybe I can introduce some of those people to the audience here.
It's great.
But yeah, so but thank you
Yeah,
again.
Bill, great to see
I
you.
always feel saner when I talk to you.
Good. Feel free to call anytime.
And yeah, thanks for taking the time, and I hope people check out the course. that you developed on Count Me In to Win. I think it's very helpful for people who want to organize in a more inclusive way that isn't so strictly partisan, that doesn't feel so exclusive, and
Amen.
dare I say, sometimes intolerant.
Yeah.
So, so thank you for doing that, and I hope people check it out. And I just linked to your website,
Thanks,
so they
Annabelle.
can go directly to your website to find out more about what you do, all the wonderful things that you're doing, because you're doing so many things. It's hard to describe you. I always struggle with it.
You're not
Um,
alone.
well, we'll talk again soon.
Sounds
We're
good.
gonna have to, yeah, we're gonna have to sit down and talk more about all these great things that I think we can look forward to.
Yeah. Excellent.
Yeah. Okay.
Have a great
Okay.
day. Be safe.
You too.
All
Have
right.
a good evening. Okay.
Bye bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to Conversations About a Way Forward from Count Me In to Win and The Talk on Main Street. To learn more, find us on Facebook at The Talk on Main Street.